out the key things you need to understand about collectivism, common ownership, and the values of fraternity. You've got the three slides at the bottom are the ones that are basically the core concepts that are covered in this session. They are very much interlinked, and they very much reflect as well some of the ideas about the human nature, and also the socialists' rejection of capitalism and their aim for a more equal and just society. You've got some images here that are just designed to really familiarise you with the different meanings that we attach to these concepts. In particular, the idea of us perhaps working in a collective way, where what is produced or profits might be equally shared amongst its workers. Also perhaps about the way we live our lives. Some socialist ideas, such as the kibbutz in Israel, for example, actually involves not just working collaboratively, but living side by side as well. Here we've got a simple visual illustration of the idea that we have a natural bond to one another, and for that reason, therefore, the way we organise our economic systems needs to reflect those kind of core values and instincts. And at the bottom, we've got what is often now referred to as the kind of the 1% of America versus the 99%, a country which since the 1970s, with huge wage stagnation, has seen a massive growth in what we call relative equality, the widening gap between rich and poor. And that distribution of wealth is one that mirrors the way America looked on the eve of the Great Depression. Collectivism can also involve a commitment to the rights and values of social groups, like the rights of the working classes or the rights of trade unions to lobby on behalf of their members, something that in the 1980s was rejected by Mrs. Thatcher. Here you can see this is very much a movement against her. But Mrs. Thatcher, who was an individualist rather than a collectivist, famously said, "There is no such thing as society, only individuals and families." So socialism is about creating a world based on cooperation. The cooperative bank is itself a successor to the Rochdale pioneers, as is the cooperative stores. And other ways in which we would see cooperation and collectivism in action is everything from our NHS, which is funded by taxes, which is universal and free at the point of delivery for most of us. Also education, housing and social care. Now I know some of these are now obviously contracted out to the private sector, but they are often seen as at the core of what socialists believe governments should be responsible for delivering. Now, the key thing that you need to really focus on here is this idea of fraternity. For revolutionary socialists, is a key concept that in particular involves the working classes, who are seen as exploited and used by capitalism, joining forces to overthrow the system of oppression that they live with. But for other socialists, it is an expression of our common humanity. And in particular, fraternity. Tony Blair famously said, "I am my brother's keeper." The poet John Donne said, "No man is an island." And even religious faiths like Islam, for example, have restrictions against the practice of charging interest for loans. We have Islamic banks. And it's this idea that we are bonded together in sort of ideas of sisterhood and brotherhood, that we care for one another. And a key kind of sort of term to use here is the idea of altruism. That's ALTRUISM, which is the idea that you give to others even if you don't gain yourself. There's no contract, there's no transaction. It's a simple belief that we care for one another. And for socialists, this reflects our true nature. Now, don't forget, socialists argue that human nature is malleable, which means it can be shaped by our economic system. Marx, in particular, argued that capitalism brings out the worst of human nature, so it distorts it. So socialists therefore seek to reorganise society in order to make sure that we can realise our true nature and get in touch with our more altruistic side, and our belief in being social animals, and our belief in solidarity. Also, it believes in the idea excuse me, that industries should be state-run or services should be controlled to protect our collective interests. As individuals, we may rationally make choices, for example, that in the long term serve nobody's collective best interest. Excuse me. And for that reason, therefore, if you think of things like public transport that we get in a car, it's convenient for us as individuals. But if we all do it individually, the net result of that is congestion. And that is a nice example where socialists believe state intervention and state management does a better job of things than, say, the private sector or capitalists, because it can think with our long-term collective interests and can regulate our decision making as a result. How all of this is then seen by socialists is a belief, therefore, that we need to act with other people in solidarity, and we also need to recognise that actually actions taken by groups is often better than actions taken by individuals. Collective bargaining is a term you might not be familiar with. It's the idea of trade unions being able to represent their members' interests and therefore have much more force than individuals acting on their own. If we then move on just briefly to see how the different strands have interpreted common ownership and collectivism, for Marx in particular, it was a simple out-and-out rejection of capitalism. For him, to have collectivism meant complete common ownership, so everything is literally communally held by everybody. And he referred in particular to what he called the forces of production, or the means of production, the businesses, the factories and the workshops, and in particular arguing that when people were allowed to accumulate wealth, to gain more wealth, to become richer and richer, that was at the expense and the misery of the exploited working classes. Again, we'll explore that in more detail later on in the course. If we perhaps look more closer to home at perhaps the most famous socialist government, this would be Clement Attlee's government of the 1945 to 51 period, and with it they gave us Clause 4. Now, Clause 4 was written in 1918 and it committed the Labour Party to complete common ownership of the means of production, again the factories and so on, and complete state control. It was in many respects radical, but was never fully implemented by Clement Attlee. Only about 20% of the economy was actually put into state hands. But it wasn't until we get to the Blair years that Clause 4 was actually rewritten. But even here, with the revised Clause 4, we do still see a commitment to the value of community, which is another way of interpreting collectivism. Now, Tony Blair's third way socialism, which came in the 1990s after Labour had been out of power for 18 years, deliberately attempted to rewrite Clause 4. It's what became known as the Clause 4 moment. It wasn't done in a secretive way. It's a very, very public statement that third way socialism was different to the socialism that had gone before. Now, this is the text of the original Clause 4, and it talks, as you can see here, common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange. That means that the state effectively runs everything from the post office to the health service, and it effectively is a radical move away from a capitalist society. As we said, in reality, Clause 4 had never really been fully implemented. In fact, as early as the 1950s, there were attempts to get rid of it when Labour was led by Hugh Gateskill. Tony Blair, however, decided that it was time to make it clear that the socialism of the Labour Party accepted capitalism. The revised Clause 4 still talks about the importance of the public, it talks about a thriving public sector here, and it talks about opportunity for all. So again, that's your socialist values. But it also talks and celebrates the enterprise of the free market and a dynamic economy. If we then look at and conclude with why liberals will reject this, and it's not that you're going to have to do this in the exam, but it helps you to really see the difference between the two, is for socialists, doing things together leads to the achievement of a better society. We are all of us ultimately better off on every level. But for our liberals, they fear collectivism for so many different reasons. Firstly, they are individualists, and therefore the only thing that society and government should care about is protecting and upholding the rights of individuals. Secondly, If you are going to have extensive state intervention, you're going to need to fund it, you're going to need to administer it. This will therefore lead to a rise in taxes, which of course can be seen as a violation of people's property rights, and also it will lead to extensive intervention in people's lives. In fact, Winston Churchill in 1945 lost the election to Clement Attlee's Labour because he compared their proposals to introduce a welfare state and a health service as taking the country down the road of Nazi Germany, and perhaps even introducing a Gestapo-style police state. His vision was one that was perhaps misjudged, but it was one that a young Margaret Thatcher, when she heard his radio address, passionately believed he was right about, that actually greater state intervention on behalf of the wider public obviously leads to a huge accumulation of state power, and Liberals believe that is an unacceptable erosion of individual liberty. Okay, everybody, I'll send you the PowerPoint as well to go with this, and the PowerPoint effectively just gives you a little bit of narration of the notes that you've got as well.